Thank you. And I want to get right to it because some of the hardest questions that you have been asked over the years come from the fact that you faced wrath from both sides of the political spectrum. So let's start with the first episode, which involved the Clinton emails and how you handled them. Democrats, of course, argue that cost Secretary Clinton the election. And I've heard you speak in Chicago at the Ideas Fest about your book. It was the first book, and shortly after A Higher Loyalty came out. And I'd like you to tell our audience about your that book and what you say about your decision to close the investigation into the emails, and then your decision to announce and reopen the investigation just days before the election, and focusing mostly on the public announcement of that.
Sure. No, it's an important question. And I think just one minor correction, I think we actually angered both Republicans and Democrats in the course of the Clinton investigation because the Republicans thought that we had given her a pass, and then the Democrats complained about decisions that we made in late October. And just because everybody's mad at you doesn't mean you're right. But I think in this circumstance, we made the best judgments that we could. And let me see if I can explain it very, very briefly. We received the investigation, which focused on whether Secretary Clinton, as Secretary of State, had mishandled classified information. We received it from inspectors general from the intelligence community and the State Department in the summer of 2015. And they made a public referral. So the world knew that this had been sent to the FBI. And we opened a criminal investigation because it seemed on its face like, yeah, Secretary Clinton had treated classified information in a way that was impermissible. That is, she had talked about classified stuff on an unclassified email system. Often the conversation focuses on the fact that it was her personal server. It really didn't matter. And what matters when you're talking about classified information is, did you talk about it on a phone or speak about it on email in the appropriate forums? Did we use a classified device to be able to talk about secret stuff? And she hadn't. She'd used unclassified email to talk about a bunch of classified stuff. And so the question as the investigation began was, what was she thinking when she did that? Because nobody had ever been prosecuted for sloppiness or for unintentionally talking about something in a place they shouldn't have. That just happens too often for it to be prosecuted. Instead, what the Department of Justice has always looked for is there evidence that this person knew they were doing something that they shouldn't be doing? And so we set out to see if we could find that evidence. And after a year of looking, we didn't find any evidence like that. We found a lot of sloppiness, a lot of secret stuff, both secret and top secret, discussed on an unclassified email system, which you just can't do, but not anything that rose to the level of a criminal prosecution. And to prosecute Secretary Clinton, you would be treating her differently than everybody else. And you can't do that and run a justice organization. So we got to the end of the investigation, and the hard part was going to be convincing the American people that we'd done it in the right way, that we had investigated one of the two presumptive candidates for president of the same party as the president in office and the attorney general. And we had said, no, there's no case here, but in a credible, reliable, trustworthy way. That was going to be the trick. How do you convince people in a politically polarized world that you did things for the right reason? And the answer is transparency. The Department of Justice has always offered transparency when it doesn't bring a case, if that's in the public interest. And here it sure was in the public interest.
When you talk about transparency, I would focus on the very well-known rule, which is you never comment on an investigation. You never announce that you're investigating, and so you wouldn't announce that you are closing it. So what do you mean by transparency in the context of an investigation?
Yeah, good question. There's no rule that says you never talk about an investigation. In fact, the Department of Justice policy has an explicit exception for confirming investigations when it's in the public interest, to reassure the public, to explain activity. And then when you close an investigation, there's a long-standing norm that in almost every case, you don't say anything. But when there's a public interest, as there was, for example, after Ferguson, Missouri, or after allegations that the IRS have been targeting Tea Party activists, the Department of Justice has long offered details to explain a decision. And so you're so right, though, about the general rule. We didn't say anything about the Clinton investigation, even though it had come to us publicly for 3 months. And then we confirmed simply the fact that we were conducting it. And then we said nothing until it was completed. And this struck me, and I think struck the Department of Justice as well, as a circumstance where the norm of providing details when it matters most was in play here, and that people needed to be assured that this decision was made for the right reasons, just like the decision not to prosecute anybody for the killing of Michael Brown and Ferguson, for example. And so it was in the lane, the normal lane of the Department of Justice, to offer this kind of transparency at the close of an investigation. And the thing I did that was not normal, that was a breach of norms and policies, was I stepped away from the Attorney General, so that rather than standing next to the Attorney General and offering the transparency, I did it separately from the Attorney General for reasons that are complicated, and we can talk about it if you want. But the bottom line—
Sure, go ahead and talk about that.
Sure. I made a judgment that I think even in hindsight is a reasonable judgment. People can see it differently. But I couldn't credibly offer transparency to the American people at that point in time, standing next to the Attorney General. There were a variety of reasons for that, but most prominently, that in just the days before we finished the investigation, she had met privately with former President Bill Clinton on an airplane on a tarmac in Phoenix, Arizona, and sort of set the world on fire with that meeting, and announced that she wouldn't step aside from the investigation, which would have been the appropriate thing to do. Instead, she said, I won't step aside, but I'll accept Jim Comey's recommendation and that of the career prosecutors. And at that moment, I thought, I never imagined I'd be in this situation, given where we are and the importance of public trust, and that she won't step aside. I think the best thing to do is for me to do something unprecedented, which is offer the transparency separately. And so I did, and was criticized by thoughtful people for that. It was a close call, and I accept the criticism. That's the hardest decision I had to make, actually the closest. But that ended the investigation, right? We're done. We've assured the American people this work has been completed and in a good way. And then I get summoned all summer long of 16 to Capitol Hill to defend the work, as does the Attorney General. And we both defend the work and say, this is over, this is done, go away, you can trust us. It's done, it's done, it's done. Okay, now come with me to October 27th. I walk into my conference room and find out that not only is it not done, but it's not done in a hugely significant way, because we have found, for reasons that also are complicated, but on the laptop of a guy named Anthony Weiner, who was married, although estranged, to Hillary Clinton's significant aide, top aide, we have found hundreds of thousands of Hillary Clinton's emails. And I remember when they told me that number, it almost knocked me back in my chair, because we had only ever found thousands of Secretary Clinton's emails, because she had culled her emails and produced about 30,000 of them to the State Department and deleted the rest. And just the number, hundreds of thousands, knocked me back. And then they knocked me back farther by saying, and we may have found the missing emails from her first 3 months as Secretary of State, which is when she was using not her personal server, but an unclassified BlackBerry to email. And if there was going to be evidence that established she knew she was doing stuff she shouldn't do, it would likely be at the beginning. Mm-hmm. And so my team said, we found hundreds of thousands of emails. We found tens of thousands of BlackBerry emails. The result of this investigation could change, and we can't review them in time before the election. What do you do?
Mm-hmm. Why couldn't they do that? Because they ended up actually doing that.
Yep. Yeah. The reasons they gave me were that we didn't have the capability in the FBI to deduplicate electronically on our classified networks, which is where these materials had to sit, because we knew they contained classified information. And we couldn't bring in recruits like we would to look for a gun in a hayfield, because whoever reviewed the emails needed to know context, because they were looking for classified information, for misuse of an unclassified email system. So it had to be people with context, and there were only about 6 or 8 of those. So that team of people had to actually read each of these emails night after night after night. And they said there just aren't enough hours in the day to finish before the election.
So let me ask you a couple follow-up questions there. One, how did you know? You said you knew immediately that there was classified information there. How had you determined that? When I say you, I'm talking about, I assume it wasn't that you physically sat down, but that an agent reported to you.
Yeah, it actually, before then, the inspectors general referred it to the FBI, because in their review of the emails that Secretary Clinton had produced to the State Department as part of a FOIA process, they had seen that on the emails there were topics talked about that they knew were classified, top secret.
Right. No, but I'm talking now about the BlackBerry. I'm sorry, not the BlackBerry. I'm talking about Anthony Weiner. His computer had emails that were addressed to his wife, and you're now saying this was the big new thing, and that it contained classified information, and you knew that on October 27th. And I'm just asking how you knew that there was classified information on Anthony Weiner's computer.
I'm sorry, if I said that, I misspoke. We didn't know what the content was of these on the computer because we hadn't gotten permission as of October 27th to review them. They've been obtained by the FBI in a different investigation.
Right.
So to look at them, we need to get a search warrant to establish probable cause that they would contain evidence of the mishandling of classified information. A fair bet, given the number of conversations that Secretary Clinton had had on her email system involving classified topics. And we could tell that the emails weren't all addressed to Weiner's wife, and a large number of them were Secretary Clinton's emails that had been forwarded, that were Huma Abedin had been copied on them, forwarded to that address. But we didn't know for sure. And the point of the investigation was, let's see what's on these and what they tell us about her intent.
Right. And I thank you for that, because, and maybe I misheard you, but I thought you said that on the 27th, you knew there was classified information there, and that's why I was asking. But
it turned out there was,
yeah.
But no new classified emails were in that trove of the hundreds of thousands.
Right. And that's the important part. So you did do that, and you did it quickly enough that it was over before the election.
Right. So
but on that day, you decided you could not possibly finish it in time, but then you did. So how did you finish in time?
The wizards at the FBI's Operational Technology Division wrote software for the classified network that allowed them to deduplicate electronically. And so they cut down hundreds of thousands to thousands. And then the team of 6 to 8 people just round the clock read emails. And they finished by the election was on a Tuesday. They finished by the Sunday morning before the election, and then asked to meet with me. And I met with them, and they said, look, we found lots of new emails that we'd never seen before. We found classified content in emails, but no new classified content. And so, and nothing different that reflects on her intention. And so it doesn't change our view of the investigation. And I was worried that it was their exhaustion talking. So I pressed them, and they said, no, we're exhausted, but we don't see anything new here that changes our view. And I said, well, then I've got to communicate that to Congress, because I had decided back on October 28th, so the week before, that we had to choose between two terrible options, one of not speaking and the other speaking, that we had to speak and tell Congress we'd reopened an investigation that we had testified under oath repeatedly was done. And we knew that testimony was false now. We had to correct that. Having done the work now and finished before the election, to my surprise, I had to tell Congress again. And so, again, we sent a very short letter to Congress saying, we've finished our review and it hasn't changed our conclusions about the investigation.
And so there was a period of time between what day did it become public that you were reopening the case?
The 28th of October.
Okay, so from October 28th until 2 days before the election, during early voting, which is a significant, even in that year, a significant number of people were using early voting, it impacted how people voted. For anyone who doubted, saying, I don't know about this, I'm not sure I can trust Hillary, this was what they needed to say, okay, I'm not voting for Hillary. What were your feelings during that period where you knew that you were having an impact on the outcome?
Well, I actually don't know. I didn't know then and still don't know, actually, that I had an impact on the outcome. And I think the 2020 election raises really interesting questions, because the late-breaking voters, again, broke overwhelmingly for Trump when I was home in my pajamas. So I don't know. I don't know exactly whether we had an impact, but I'm not trying to be funny. It just
It's
doesn't
just
change
funny
my.
thinking of you at home in your pajamas
Yeah, that's
before
how
COVID.
I know.
During COVID, I get it.
But it doesn't
um,
change how I think about the problem. I assumed that we might have an impact on the election. It was a nightmare, and that either decision we made might have an impact on the election. That we could speak and say the testimony we gave all summer is false. We've reopened the investigation, or we could conceal that we had restarted the investigation. Either choice was going to have an impact potentially on the election. You can't make the judgment on that basis. Then you have to decide, well, which one is the least bad of these options. And I hope it doesn't sound crazy to people, but even in hindsight, I think we chose the least bad. I wish we weren't involved, but I think you couldn't choose. People have said differently, and I respect that. I think if you really care about this and dive into it, try to imagine yourself in my position, concealing that the testimony you gave under oath was false in this circumstance when the result might change and you're being told by your team you can't finish the work before the election. People might do differently, but it's a very hard decision at absolute best.
Yeah, you are doing a very good job of explaining yourself now, which is, I think, the important thing I wanted to accomplish here was, and I'm going to read one quote from your book, Higher Loyalty, where you wrote, assuming as nearly everyone did that Hillary Clinton would be elected president of the United States in less than 2 weeks, what would happen to the FBI, the Justice Department, or her own presidency if it later was revealed after the fact that she was still the subject of an FBI investigation? So I think that's what you're saying now is, as you were considering, what are my options here? What can I do? You had to weigh that it might turn out that she would be elected and that you had changed the outcome in some way, or that you had not revealed the fact that she had been under investigation. And then balance that against the fact that she might lose because you made this announcement. And that's what I think I'm hearing you say now, is that those were the factors you were balancing.
Yeah, I was trying to push politics out, but I saw two norms crashing into each other. One is well-established norm we've talked about, that
Right.
except in extraordinary circumstances, we don't talk about our investigations, and we try not to take any action in the run-up to an election that might have an impact on the election. I've lived by that norm my whole career.
Mm-hmm.
Second norm is we tell the truth. And when we have given testimony that turns out to be false or incomplete, we fix it. And so which norm should win here? And I saw in the moment, as soon as they briefed me, I saw the collision between those two things. As I said, I think even in hindsight, I wish we hadn't been involved at all, but given where we were, I think we chose the door we had to choose.